Hey everyone, tonight we embark on a journey into the extraordinary lives of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, time and again, defied bone-chilling nights and merciless darkness. From crude insulation hacks to huddling under frost-slick straw, their story isn't about comfort, it's about survival, ingenuity, and unbreakable determination. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would offer a knowing chuckle, or perhaps a sharp reminder. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were enthusiastic wind tunnels masquerading as shelters. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's drift back through time together. Forget grand tournaments and royal feasts. Medieval winter for the average peasant wasn't a backdrop for legend, but a season-length test, a relentless teacher that allowed no second chances. Forget grand tournaments and royal feasts. Medieval winter for the average peasant wasn't a backdrop for legend, but a season-length test, a relentless teacher that allowed no second chances. Imagine yourself inside a cramped cottage made of wattle and daub, sticks laced with mud, straw, even dung for insulation, walls so thin you could almost hear a bird sneeze just outside the dewy morning air. No windows to speak of, unless you count a goat hide flap, patched and fraying, acting as the only barrier. Inside, the temperature barely hovered a few degrees above freezing if the wind outside was biting. Inside was just slightly less punishing. Congratulations, you've achieved less freezing by inches. If you find yourself warming to these tales, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe, only if you honestly enjoy what I share here. And in the comments, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing who's listening from around the world. Forget grand tournaments and royal feasts. Medieval winter for the average peasant wasn't a backdrop for legend, but a season-length test, a relentless teacher that allowed no second chances. Imagine yourself inside a cramped cottage made of wattle and daub, sticks laced with mud, straw, even dung for insulation, walls so thin you could almost hear a bird sneeze just outside the dewy morning air. No windows to speak of, unless you count a goat hide flap, patched and fraying, acting as the only barrier. Inside, the temperature barely hovered a few degrees above freezing if the wind outside was biting. Inside was just slightly less punishing. Congratulations, you've achieved less freezing by inches. Nights offered no mercy, darkness thickened, the wind howled like a grief-stricken ghost, and the hearth, your center of light and hope, spat and sputtered. Roasting toes only inches away. Move just a foot further, and you were risking snowfall-level chill with worse snacks. Layered wool tunics, patched cloaks that smelled vaguely of barn, all promising warmth but delivering itch and cold. Beds were nothing more than hay-filled sacks, sometimes tossed over earth floors with zero frost protection. Bonus if you got fleas for company. True luxury, right? 8. The cold was a silent predator. Frostbite, hypothermia, death lurking in every frozen breath. Waking up still breathing? That was closer to luck than the norm, and celebration worthy. Maybe toast a semi-frozen turnip while it lasts. 9. Winter survival was a bare-knuckle game, clinging every scrap of cloth, huddling with livestock, if invited over, and praying you'd wake without icicles forming on your eyelashes. And believe me, the night was just beginning. Most of these wattle and daub cottages began as nothing more than a wooden skeleton, interwoven sticks smeared with a hardy paste of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. Not for shock value. Dung was plentiful, sticky, and surprisingly good at trapping heat. Despite their meticulous plastering, those walls didn't stand a chance against the full force of winter. Wind found every crack, made itself at home, and swirled through these single-room dwellings like a mischievous spirit. Privacy? Forgotten. Warmth? A pipe dream. Character plus? Absolutely. Then consider the roofs. Thatch may look pastoral in storybooks, but in practice, after relentless rain and snow, it sagged, leaked, and invited unwelcome guests. Try dining with a squirrel dropping through your ceiling. Suddenly your cottage's quirk feels a lot less charming. Windows were another luxury peasants almost never enjoyed. Tiny openings, often nothing more than animal hides or wooden planks. Glass was rarer than a snowflake in summer, so scarce. Even manor lords barely had more than one small pane. Peasants were overjoyed when their cowhide curtains survived the storm without flapping off mid-blizzard. Underfoot? Compact dirt, occasionally softened with straw or rushes, if you were lucky. But heavy rains or frozen ground turned the floor into a frozen marsh. Every step felt like pushing through iced-up swampland. Cold overhead, cold upward from the earth, an assault on all sides. Yet, peasants endured, not by complaining, but by ingenuity. Moss stuffed into cracks, rag-filled gaps, and walls greased with sheep suet served as primitive, but effective, insulation. Families huddled together, limbs pressed tight, sharing heat as living insulation. It was a solution born not of comfort, but necessity, shepherded by grit, resourcefulness, and just enough humor to keep the chattering teeth at bay. Within this mud and stick fortress, laughter sometimes broke through the cold, because if your house was falling apart and your only defense against frost was mud and goat hair, You either cried or you dared to smile instead. And smiling, albeit with chattering teeth, was a victory in itself. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't floors in the modern sense, they were barely smoothed patches of hard-packed dirt inside your hut. If you were lucky, or sneaky, someone might toss down a handful of straw or some rushes to give the illusion of comfort. But don't be fooled, you were sleeping just one insultingly thin layer away from the cold. Hard earth, and oh, that cold was merciless. It seeped up through the bedding like a malevolent little ghost, winding its way through the straw into your bones and down to your very core. Drop something onto the floor in the dead of winter? Congratulations, it became part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants fought this grim foe with ingenuity. The ideal solution was thick mats of straw covering the earth, but let's be honest. Most of the time it meant stealing enough hay from a neighbor's field without being caught. Straw flattened fast, turned moldy faster, and offered a nightly soundtrack, crunch, crunch as you tossed and turned. Some homes used spread layers of dried rushes instead, fresh rushes layered over old, neglected ones. Over time, this created a living ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and who knows what else crawling in. Essentially medieval carpet padding, damp, ever-changing, faintly smelling of wet dog and ancient hay. As for beds, if you even had one, it wasn't much better. Wooden frames were stuffed with more straw or hay, making a rudimentary mattress that was as lumpy as it was ineffective. Instead of dreamy comfort, every toss became a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and prevent one side of your body from freezing solid. Because at the end of the day, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground, they learned to live miserably above it. A successful night's sleep wasn't about softness or dreams, it was about waking up with all your toes intact. And if you pulled that off, well, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dung and straw insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that stood as the only true defense against the cold, the blackness, and the crushing gloom that shrouded medieval life. At the heart of nearly every peasant home sat a simple fire. Not a grand fireplace with sculpted mantel, nor a tidy chimney channeling smoke into the sky. Rather, a basic pit or ring of stones, filled with half-burned logs and enough smoke to make you wonder if you were slowly turning into a roast. That's right, most homes lacked chimneys. Smoke roamed freely, escaping through small roof holes, sneaking out cracks, or sometimes just drifting directly into your lungs if it felt lazy. Of course, this was terrible for your health, but consider the upside. The smoke doubled as pest control. Fleas and other unwanted visitors didn't stick around long when they were marinated in smoke day and night. Of course, this was terrible for your health, but consider the upside. The smoke doubled as pest control. Fleas and other unwanted visitors didn't stick around long when they were marinated in smoke day and night, but the hearth was more than just a furnace. It was the kitchen, the glow of evening, the medieval version of television. Families gathered, passing time with stories, gossip, or simply gazing into the dancing embers because, frankly, after sunset there wasn't much else to do. Keeping that fire alive wasn't optional. Let it die overnight, and the cold would curl inside like a predator, ready to finish the job. Reigniting the fire wasn't as simple as striking a match. It needed flint, steel, careful kindling, and perhaps more prayers than they'd ever uttered before. Everyone played a part, coaxing embers, adding tiny twigs, or treasuring a small piece of dry wood. It was a relentless tussle between human will and the suffocating cold that aimed to snuff them out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival became a near impossibility. It was smoky, sputtering, often disappointing, yet in the heart of a medieval winter, it meant hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than the barrel running dry, it was letting the fire die out overnight. Without that orange glow breathing in the darkness, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the heart of winter, starting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be life-threatening. Matches didn't exist. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling that life-saving warmth meant striking flint and steel together, coaxing a single fragile spark to life, then carefully nurturing it with whatever dry kindling hadn't already been burned days ago. Now imagine doing this in the pitch-black dark, half asleep, with frozen fingers. Add a hungry wolf's howl in the distance for extra motivation. So they got clever. They banked the fire, not depositing embers in a cozy account, but layering the glowing coals carefully under a thick mound of ash before sleep. The ash served as an insulating blanket, keeping embers alive just long enough to relight at dawn. Do it right, and you could tiptoe out of bed at sunrise. Poke the coals, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without frostbite. Do it wrong, and mornings turned brutally cold and grumblingly miserable. This fire banking wasn't guesswork, it was an art passed down like family lore. Every household had secret variations. Some swore by only dry ash, Others insisted on a bit of dampness. Some packed the coals tightly, others allowed them to breathe. You could have sparked a medieval feud just by suggesting an improvement. Think barbecue debates with higher stakes. Even firebanking didn't guarantee success. A stealthy gust could slip in overnight and smother the embers. Or an unwitting sheep might stumble into the hearth, and yes, it happened. That's why families often rotated who stayed up to check on the embers, essentially early versions of midnight thermostat monitor. In the end, firebanking wasn't about taming the elements, it was about buying a few precious hours of warmth. Wake to even one red ember and that was your victory, forging strength to face another frigid day. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't about parties, it was a matter of survival. When the hearth sputtered and icy winds sliced through every crack, there was one undeniable source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with the whole family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a bewildered goose, so be it. Privacy? Forgotten. Comfort? A fantasy. Survival? The only currency that mattered. On the coldest nights, households inched into the warmest corner of their one-room home, draping themselves in every available scrap of cloth, creating what could only be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Kids squeezed safely between parents. Grandparents cocooned under outer layers. And if Cousin Ethel dropped by, there was always, or reluctantly, room for one more. The ideal was to sleep nestled in the middle, bathed in body heat from all sides. But if you got stuck on the edge, consider yourself the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the meat locker door. Roll too far in the night, and you risked sending Aunt Maud into the frigid draft, instantly becoming the family villain. Even bedding was shared. Communal straw mattresses flattened under the weight of generations. Add lackluster hygiene and you had something not remotely fragrant. But faced with frostbite, peasants didn't fuss. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategy. Some guides suggested positioning the strongest and warmest people around the outside, like human shields, while tucking babies and frail elders deep inside, precious little heat generators. This wasn't just survival, it became part of daily life. Forging bonds in the frozen darkness. Storytelling, singing, and hushed conversations over wool blankets became winter traditions. So the next time someone steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. Modern roommates seem chaotic compared to medieval housemates. Peasants shared their homes with cows, goats, pigs, chickens, anything breathing a bit of heat. This wasn't quirky, it was essential. Livestock generated warmth and, tucked inside a poorly insulated hut, every degree mattered. Plus, housing your goat inside made theft less likely. Two benefits. One stinky solution. At night, homes became chaotic furnaces. Chickens nestled in corners, pigs snorted by the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. Not glamorous, but effective. Ever been stuck in a car with someone who forgot to shower? That's a summer vacation compared to a farmhouse in winter. By spring, the perfume of that shared winter was unforgettable. No candle needed. Your nose had seen enough. Yet medieval noses adjusted. Complaining about the smells was pointless. Cold kills, and cows cuddle, sometimes literally with slobber. The math was simple. More animals meant fewer frozen toes. Cows, being the largest and warmest, often took center stage. Goats, ever resourceful, squeezed closer. Chickens perched high in rafters. Pigs plopped themselves wherever convenient, usually the floor's middle. Of course, sleeping with livestock had risks. A chicken might choose your hair as a roost. Awaken barefoot only to step in something suspicious? Classic medieval morning. But despite noise, fecund odors, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants accepted the trade-off: warmth over hygiene, survival over smell. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't browsing trends, they were gearing up for a full-body siege against the cold. The unwritten rule: if you owned a garment, you wore it, often, all at once. It began with a scratchy linen undertunic, probably less than fresh, followed by one or more heavier wool tunics. Then came saggy leggings, a rough cloak draped over shoulders, and, if fortune favored you, a patched sheepskin thrown on like a victory flag. Result? You'd gain maybe 10% warmth but trade it immediately for 90% itch. Boots were rare luxuries. Most wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or rag, stuffed into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, you'd rip another rag around your foot, praying your toes wouldn't simply fall off. Cleaning wasn't an option. Washing clothes meant dragging them through ice-frozen streams and waiting days for a single shirt to dry, if it didn't freeze mid-cycle. Most peasants decided smelling like smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for survival. Surprisingly, this grimy buildup had an upside: insulation. Dirt and grease clogged the fabric, trapping heat, like wearing a medieval version of Gore-Tex, just smellier and less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were treasured. A simple wool cap might mean the difference between surviving the night and waking with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were handmade from scraps, more like ragged puppet hands than refined fashion statements. Children were swaddled to look like bulbous, waddling turnips, each inch of cloth serving to trap precious warmth. Forget elegance, warmth was the real medieval flex. Next time you layer up for a brisk day, remember, peasants once wore half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry hampers, and counted themselves lucky. Medieval peasant beds were a far cry from plush hotel luxury. If you were fortunate enough to own a basic wooden frame, it would be draped with a large sack bursting with straw, hay, or dried rushes. That was it. No memory foam. No supportive layers. Just a crunchy, lumpy, pokey mess that carried the lingering scent of the barnyard and regret. Every restless night came with a symphony of crinkles and crunches, punctuated by the sudden, painful jab of a rogue straw stalk. And if you didn't even have a frame, you just dumped the straw on the dirt floor and called it ground-connected slumber. Modern influencers would probably label it. It wasn't cozy. Over time, the straw flattened, mold set in, bugs made it home. It became a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a major event, done once in spring or only when your bed started moving on its own. Rushes offered a slightly better alternative. Long grasses, sometimes woven into mats, sometimes just scattered, were laid thick across the floor. Some peasant households sprinkled fragrant herbs like lavender or rosemary over them to mask daily odors. Fresh rushes smelled nice, for about a day. After that, they blended into the muddy, tramped terrain of the interior, an unholy mix of dirt, scraps, and whatever else got tracked in. And let's not ignore the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved a straw bed just as much as peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than sleeping, congratulations, yep. You were living the authentic medieval experience. But despite these hardships, those lowly beds provided vital insulation from the frozen ground below. Piles of straw lifted bodies off the chill, and shared bedding turned into pockets of communal warmth, medieval central heating at its rudimentary best. Next time you sink into that plush mattress of yours, spare a thought for the peasant somewhere through time, peering down with a missing tooth grin, whispering, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and sheer hope, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just an annoyance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold outside, they battled it within their own homes. Armed with nothing but whatever soft, squishy material they could cram into every crack. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Wattle and daub walls warped, mud crumbled, and thatch sagged. Cold crept in incessantly, sneaking through gaps like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became a fine art. Peasants stuffed moss, straw, old scraps of cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair, into holes. Soft and vaguely insulating? That counted. Some industrious souls daubed extra coats of mud and dung onto their exterior walls annually. Imagine shivering in the freezing cold while slapping cold manure onto your own home. Muttering, "This is fine, pure luxury," yet in a strange way, it was luxury indeed. Roofs proved another battlefield. Thatch, though cheap and easy to harvest, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after relentless rain and snow. Cracks in the roof were plugged with rag remnants, bundles of reeds, or, in dire moments, chunks of turf filched from nearby fields, resulting in houses that looked like sad patchwork quilts assembled by someone halfway through the job. Do you have doors or windows? Lucky you. Usually, they were nothing more than wooden boards hung by nail and stubbornness. Window openings, when present, were sealed with animal hides or thick cloth smeared in animal fat, serving as draft barriers and adding a bonus whiff of mystery meat to the air. Every night was a showdown between human resourcefulness and the relentless sneakiness of cold. One moment, you were cozy, the next, a forgotten gap would yawn open under a rush of icy wind, slapping you awake like a frosty fist from the beyond. Yet somehow, through stubborn creativity and refusal to accept perpetual half-frozen misery, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and mudded their way through winter, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold sank its teeth so deep it yanked you from sleep, medieval peasants had a strategy that would make modern military planners nod in admiration: sleeping in shifts. This wasn't a formal drill with bugles and roll call, it was a raw, desperate necessity spawned from the relentless chill.